Greetings, everybody. This is Pastor Mock, and we are now in the fifth lesson of our Temple Presence of God series. And last time we looked at the Temple of Solomon, and now we are considering the Second Temple. So the Second Temple is the temple after the Solomonic Temple. It's the temple that was restored and rebuilt in exile before and during the days of Ezra. It was this temple that was also plundered and desecrated in 167 BC by Antiochus Epiphanes IV. It was then repaired and cleansed and rededicated by Judas Maccabeus in 164 BC. Then it was later expanded and significantly updated by Herod the Great, begun in 20 BC. So that's a summary of what the Second Temple is. We're looking this lesson at the Second Temple in the Old Testament time, and then in the Intertestamental period, and then in the time of Herod. So the major players in the Second Temple in the Old Testament period are Haggai and Zechariah, and then later Ezra and Nehemiah. Haggai and Zechariah are prophets, and Ezra was a priest scribe, and Nehemiah was a cupbearer and then governor. So we're going to look at Haggai and Zechariah. They were contemporary prophets, and they were prophets to Judah. Remember, at this time, the northern kingdom is no more. They're gone, taken up to Syria in 722 BC. And now in 520, we have Haggai, his ministry, and then 520 to 518 is Zechariah's ministry. And these prophets are prophesying to those in Judah. And there's a background behind Haggai and Zechariah's prophecies. The background is of King Cyrus. You might remember him. He is the king of Persia. Well, in 539 BC, Cyrus issues a decree for the Israelites to go home and to build the temple. Now, he issues this decree after he overthrows Babylon. Babylon has fallen, just as Jeremiah had prophesied in Jeremiah chapters 50 and 51. Also, just as Habakkuk had prophesied as well. So Cyrus issues this decree, and 50,000 Israelites had returned to Judah under Sheshbazzar and Zerubbabel, who were appointed governors of the province of Judah. And Joshua was the high priest at this time. There's that famous passage in Zechariah chapter 3 of Joshua the high priest and Satan being the accuser. That's this Joshua. In 537, 536 BC, the Second Temple construction had begun. Now this is recorded in Ezra, so it can be a little confusing. You have Ezra recording events that he was not present to experience, kind of like Moses wasn't present to experience creation, but or the lives of Abraham, for instance. He recounts, under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, in the Pentateuch, what had happened. Ezra also gives us a record of what transpired before he gets on the scene. And so we read in Ezra 3:8 that the construction of the Second Temple begins. The people built an altar on the temple ruins, And then they celebrate the Feast of Booths, or Feast of Tabernacles. And you might recall that the Feast of Booths was a celebration of deliverance from the Egyptians. So this celebration of salvation then is celebrated anew, but not because they were delivered out of the hands of the Egyptians, but delivered out of the hands of the Babylonians, just as God had promised. The people also laid the foundation of the temple. And so you see that they build an altar, and they celebrate, they lay the foundation of the temple. All this is recorded in Ezra 3. But in Ezra chapters 4 and 5, we read of opposition. There's opposition to the temple rebuilding. And this opposition is too much for the people of God. And so they stop the construction phase. Also, we read that the Israelites cared more for their own houses than for the house of God. So that rebuilding ceases. From 536 to 520, then, so we have 16 years, the temple area lies desolate until Haggai enters. Remember, Haggai's ministry is 520 BC, and Zechariah 520 to 518. So Haggai and Zechariah tag team with prophetic messages to the people of God, with calls to the people of God. Now, in a few weeks, we are going to begin another series for our adult Bible fellowship, and that series will be in the minor prophets. So we're going to look at each of those prophets in somewhat depth. So I'm not going to go into great detail right now, but Haggai and Zechariah, they again are prophets calling upon the people of God to get to work. And Haggai, his name means feast or festival, and his main message is that the Lord has disciplined his people with poor harvests and economic trials because they have neglected the temple. They have neglected to rebuild this temple. And so Haggai delivers 4 messages over a 4-month period in the 8th to the 12th month in the Israelite calendar in the year 520 BC. So his first message is recorded in Haggai chapter 1. Haggai is not a large book, just 2 chapters. And in the first chapter, he calls them to rebuild the temple. And we're thankful that they respond positively to this call. In Haggai 1, 12 through 15, for instance, we read, "Then Zerubbabel, the son of Shealtiel, and Joshua, the son of Jehozadak, the high priest, with the remnant of the people, obeyed the voice of the Lord their God, and the words of Haggai the prophet, as the Lord their God had sent him. And the people feared the Lord. Then Haggai, the messenger of the Lord, spoke to the people with the Lord's message. 'I am with you,' declares the Lord. And the Lord stirred up the spirit of Zerubbabel, the son of Shealtiel, governor of Judah, and the spirit of Joshua, the son of Jehozadak, the high priest, and the spirit of all the remnant of the people. And they came and worked on the house of the Lord of hosts, their God. On the 24th day of the month, in the 6th month, in the 2nd year of Darius the king." That's great news. They respond well to Haggai's message for them to rebuild the temple. Then in chapter 2 of Haggai, verses 1 through 9, there is the promise of future glory for the temple. I won't read all of it, but the verses talk about the coming glory of the temple. So in the 7th month, on the 21st day of the month, the word of the Lord came by the hand of Haggai the prophet. "Speak now to Zerubbabel, the son of Shealtiel, governor of Judah, and to Joshua, the son of Jehozadak, the high priest, and to all the remnant of the people, and say, Who is left among you who saw this house in its former glory? How do you see it now? Is it not as nothing in your eyes? Yet now be strong, O Zerubbabel, declares the Lord. Be strong, O Joshua, son of Jehozadak the high priest. Be strong, all you people of the land, declares the Lord. Work, for I am with you, declares the Lord of hosts, according to the covenant that I made with you when you came out of Egypt. My spirit remains in your midst. Fear not. So the Lord promises his spirit with them as they would continue to work on this house, on the temple. But when you read that text, you'll notice that there is no indication of when the glory of God is going to re-enter the temple of God. You have the promise that God doesn't leave his people, that God is always with those who have faith in him. But there is no assurance that at this time the glory of God will re-enter that temple. After Haggai's second message, Zechariah offers a message, and you see this in Zechariah 1 and 3. He calls the people to return to the Lord. He calls them to break away from their previous generation's rebellion. Don't be like the generation that was the one that led up to the exile. This is very similar to Moses and to Joshua. When Moses and Joshua speak to that second generation of Israelites. Don't be like the first generation that died in the wilderness. So now we have the message, don't be like the faithless fathers. Return to the Lord. He also charges the people with rebuilding the temple. Then we go back to Haggai in chapter 2, verses 10 to 19. There is his third message to the people. And in this message, it's full of hope. There is the promise of a future blessing that will replace defilement. Then the fourth message, at the end of chapter 2, verses 20 to 23, is the promise to Zerubbabel. And that promise is that the Lord is going to shake the heavens and earth, and he's going to overthrow the kingdoms, the pagan kingdoms. This promise also includes the restoration of the rule of David. So these are great things that are forthcoming. And these are promises that the people of God can depend on. They can know to be certain because they're coming from the messenger of the Lord. After Haggai's fourth message, Zechariah has several messages. He has several visions. He has 8 visions. He speaks also of the Israelites' fasts of mourning. They mourn for the exile. He calls the people for justice in the land. And he also promises a future restoration of the kingdom of God. So again, these are good things that the people can expect as they lean upon their Lord. And then in 515 BC, the temple is completed. And you read of this in Ezra 6, 13 to 18. The temple is completed, and it is dedicated, and it's dedicated with offerings. 100 bulls, 200 rams, 400 lambs. These are all offered, and there is also a sin offering for all of Israel that took the form of 12 male goats, perhaps a goat per tribe. Considering the fullness of the people of God, there's that sin offering for all of Israel. So that's a good response from the people of God. Ezra, post exile. Ezra, again, doesn't come to Jerusalem until 50 plus years, about 57 years after Haggai and Zechariah minister to them. He arrives in 458 BC, and he finds the fortification of Jerusalem ceased. Jerusalem needs to be strong, well fortified. And Ezra sees that those efforts of fortification have gone by the wayside. Later on, a little over a decade, Nehemiah arrives in 445 BC to help restore the walls of Jerusalem. A couple things worthy of note. In the narrative in Haggai, in the prophecies of Haggai and Zechariah, and in the narratives of Ezra and Nehemiah, we do not see the Ark of the Covenant mentioned. And we also don't see the glory of God re-entering the temple. Remember, with the tabernacle and with the temple, you do have the cloud, the glory cloud of God filling the houses, right? The tabernacle and the temple. You also have the glory of God filling these houses. And sometimes even fire coming down, consuming altars. You don't see that in this second temple situation. That's important because it tells us that the glory of God, God's presence, is not pleased to dwell in this new temple. Remember, the temple of God, the glory of God, has departed. You had that vision in Ezekiel 8 through 11. So that's Second Temple in the Old Testament time, during Haggai, Zechariah, Ezra, and Nehemiah. Then there's Second Temple in the Intertestamental period. The Intertestamental period is that period between Malachi and Matthew. Sometimes it's called 400 years of silence. Now, it's silence because there's nothing in the Bible that is written during those times. But it's not silence in that nothing happens. Obviously, there's a lot that happens during those 4 centuries, and we see a lot of that in the apocryphal books, for instance, 1st and 2nd Maccabees. So during this intertestamental period, we have a lot going on, as I said. One in 175 BC, Antiochus IV, also known as Antiochus Epiphanes, which means manifest God. He Hellenizes Jerusalem. He Greekifies Jerusalem. He outlaws Judaism and its forms of worship, especially the temple. In 167 BC, he loots the temple. He erects a statue of himself in the temple courtyard. He converts the temple itself into one that is devoted to the Greek god Zeus. He then places an altar for Zeus, and he sacrifices a pig on the altar, thereby desecrating the temple. Of course, the pig was an unclean animal for the Israelites. So this was a slap in their face. Enter Mattathias and his 5 sons, a Jewish priestly family. And they say, enough is enough. We cannot have any more of this. And they lead a revolt. One of the sons is Judas Maccabeus. Maccabeus means the hammer. And this son, Judas Maccabeus, lays down the hammer on Antiochus' army in 164 BC, and they recapture Jerusalem, recleanse the temple, and as a result of this reconsecration, they celebrate. Obviously, this is a time for celebration. Defilement is over. Repristination has taken place. And this celebration later becomes known as Hanukkah. And so there's relative peace in the land until the Romans come in 63 BC under General Pompey. He lays siege to Jerusalem. He enters the temple himself, even the most holy place. But again, there's no mention of the Ark of the Covenant. And there's no mention of any cherubim. Remember the function of the cherubim all the way back in Genesis chapter 3. And the priest judges that had that same function was to guard. It was to guard the holiness of God. Guard the temple. Guard the tabernacle. And so the cherubim are nowhere to be seen. In other words, the guards are gone. Why are the guards gone? Because there's nothing for them to guard. Perhaps this is why the pagan Pompey can enter even this most holy place unscathed. That's intertestamental period in a nutshell with respect to the Second Temple. Then we have the Herodian era. The Romans allowed the Idumean Antipater, and then later his son Herod, who becomes Herod the Great. The Romans allowed them to rule Judea and Jerusalem. And in 40 BC, Herod becomes king over Judea. Now we have to ask ourselves about the motives of Herod the Great. Were his motives Godward with respect to this temple reconstruction, temple beautification? Well, they were not pure motives by any stretch of the imagination. His motives were to make known his greatness, not the greatness, nor the grace of God. So he was an Idumean. In other words, he was an Edomite from the family of Esau. So he was not a true Israelite. He was not Jewish. But the Romans didn't care about this kind of ethnic subtlety. That mattered little to them. And Herod, just to give you some background about this guy and his heart, he kills 2 of his sons and his Jewish princess wife because he feared that they might overthrow him. This was the Herod, by the way, who had slaughtered those Bethlehem babies in Matthew 2, verses 16 and 18. He had many temple projects. This temple in Jerusalem was not the only temple project he had done, even though it was perhaps his greatest project. He had the one in Jerusalem, dedicated to the God of the Jews, but he had 3 others in Sebast, Caesarea, and Paneas. And these were pagan temples devoted to his patron, Caesar Augustus. And some say that Herod simply beautified what existed of the Second Temple. Others say that Herod had to demolish the old temple entirely, the one that was built by Zerubbabel and Haggai. Let's look at the temple layout and consider the inside and the outside of the temple. And at this point, then I direct your attention to the whiteboard, and hopefully you can see some of what's going on there. And I'll point out some things there. But in the temple layout, we have the porch is 172 feet wide. The temple proper, which includes the holy and most holy places, was between 103 and 120 feet wide. You have the holy place right there, HP. This was where John the Baptist's father, Zechariah, was burning incense when the angel of the Lord appeared to him in Luke chapter 1, 8-20. Then the most holy place, MHP here, the measurements are 34 by 34. So when you look inside the temple area, we have the altar of incense, which is in the holy place. And, of course, that is to indicate, well, it could have a couple functions, like the altar of incense in the temple and then in the tabernacle. Some say it's for the prayers of the people of God as they rise up, as they ascend to God. Others see the incense as a way of clouding the area to prevent themselves from fully seeing the glory of God because of his majesty and refulgence and brightness. It's too much. And there is no evidence. This is very noteworthy. You see this. You don't see this at all in Josephus when he recounts, or in the Mishnah, oral tradition of the rabbis that gets passed down finally in written form around 200 AD. There is no evidence of there being anything in the most holy place. Well, there usually, in the tabernacle and the temple, there aren't many things in the most holy place, but you have the Ark of the Covenant and the cherubim. Right? Those are really important items in the most holy place. But there's no mention of this ark in the Second Temple. There may have been a reconstructed ark for the high priest on the Day of Atonement, for instance, to do his Day of Atonement duties. There may have been a reconstructed ark, but if there wasn't, then there was nothing. And there's likely a completely empty room, which, of course, ought to tell us that the glory of God is not in this Second Temple. There are no solid doors like there were in the Solomonic Temple. There were only two very thick veils or curtains separating the three rooms. You have the most holy place, and then the porch. The Solomonic Temple height was 45 feet, but the Herodian temple, Second Temple height was 172 feet, more than tripled the height of the Solomonic Temple. Herod really did go big. There is the laver and there is an altar. The laver is that basin of water that had the same function as the sea basin in Solomon's temple, the function being that of purification. The altar for offerings was larger than the altar in Solomon's day. And this likely, here's the altar, this likely was where Joseph and Mary offered 2 doves, pigeons, when they were completing the ritual purification. You might remember, of course, you are well familiar with Leviticus chapter 12 that offers law on how to be purified after you give birth to either a male or a female. Well, the poorest of the poor, the poorest of the kinds of families, would offer a pigeon or a dove. And that's exactly what Joseph and Mary offer when Mary's time of purification is over. Luke 2:22-24. We move into the inner temple and we see some courtyards. A lot of courts here, right? And there are there's the court of the priests, this area. And surrounding the temple, there are 2 standing spectator areas. There's the courtyard of Israel, or courtyard of Israelites. No women were allowed in this area. Jewish men can come here. They can come to watch the sacrifice of their animals. They can come to watch the burnt offerings. And there is one close to the altar. See some rooms and gates here. There's one close to the altar. This was designated for bystanders and observers, but is for priests and Levites who were not involved in the actual sacrifices of that day. There is also the court of women. This was separated by a wall and a gate, the Nicanor gate here. And this is a large courtyard around the temple. Both men and women can be in here, but obviously women cannot go beyond this area. This court is also associated with the temple treasury. And there are 4 chambers, and these chambers might have various things here. Chambers for lepers, chambers to hold wood, and chamber for oil, chamber for the Nazarites. And Simeon and Anna in Luke 2:25-28 are probably in this area when they recognize baby Jesus to be the Messiah. Jesus also may have been in this court area in John 8, verse 20, when he was teaching in the courts near the place the offerings were put. Jesus here also commends the widow in Mark chapter 12, verses 41-44, the widow who gave those 2 small copper coins. From the court of women to the Nicanor gate, which leads into the inner temple courtyard, there's the gate, goes through. You have a stairway of 15 steps. It's a semicircle. And there are 15 steps and 1 step for each of the Psalms of Ascent. The Psalms of Ascent are Psalms 120 through 134. And the Levites would stand and sing their psalms around this area. There are many other courtyards and areas in this temple block. There are many gates. There's a double gate, and there's a triple gate. There are also gates for the priests on the west side, which is different from the tabernacle and the Solomonic temple, which didn't have any gates on the west. You would only be coming from the east. You wouldn't be coming from behind the temple area. There were baths for ritual cleansing just outside the temple wall. That's what this temple wall here is. So outside, in order for you to be purified to come in, you would take a bath and a mikvah. There's a big mikvah, and a mikvah, in the plural mikvot, mikvah is a big area that has steps that you would go down into, and there would be running water at the bottom, because running water is lively water, living water, necessary for cleansing. And you'd go down into the mikvah, and then you come up, be purified. So there were mikvahot outside the temple area to prepare you to go in. There were also colonnaded porticos, Solomon's colonnade, and these are a few stories as well. Okay, it's not just one level, and this is a triple colonnaded royal stoa or royal porch, and this was where Herod would entertain guests and have official ceremonies. There is the western wall, some of which is still standing today, also known as the Wailing Wall. Either in this area or in a similar walled area, it's likely that Jesus' parents found Jesus among the teachers in Luke 2:46. Underground, there were tunnels that Herod had made. And I could be wrong about this, but I think these were done even from the days of Hezekiah. Then there's also the court of the Gentiles. There's a northern court and a southern court. As the name indicates, this was for Gentiles and non-Jews. If you were a Gentile, you could only be in this court area. And what would a Gentile be doing? Well, he might be a Gentile convert to Judaism, doing some temple work, a God-fearer. And there is this fence, okay? There's this fence with a sign prohibiting Gentiles from entering. And if a Gentile went beyond this area, went into the court of Israel, then what would happen is he would be killed. You enter into the court of Israel upon death. There's an account of Paul getting into some trouble in Acts 21, 27 to 32. He was accused of bringing a Gentile, Trophimus, past the court of Gentiles. He didn't do that, but he was accused of that. It was also here that Jesus drove out the money changers and animal vendors in John 2, 13 to 22. So final comments here quickly. As externally glorious as this second temple was, there was no divine glory that indwelt it. No, there was no glory of God that entered into this temple since the departure of God before the Babylonians. Before the Babylonians came and ransacked Jerusalem and the temple. The glory of God never returned after he had left. Because of the corruption of religious leaders and of the rejection of the temple of God, namely Jesus Christ himself, we should not be surprised to find out later that the Herodian temple is destroyed in AD 70. And Jesus would often say, and this is in the Olivet Discourse, that this generation will not pass away until all kinds of things happen. And he talks about the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple. And he talks about this destruction of the temple because the religious leaders did not come to believe in Jesus Christ. So in AD 70, finally, there's that consummation of there's the culmination of the Romans' conquest of Jerusalem and the temple. And this is from AD 66 to AD 70. You can read about this account in Josephus. This sad news doesn't, however, cause despair. Shouldn't, because the Son of God, by the Spirit of God, indwells all who entrust themselves to him for eternal life. And we become that living temple, those living stones that Peter talks about, built up as a spiritual house. We become this for the very purpose of worshiping the true temple, our God, who is full of glory and grace and truth. I hope this lesson was helpful on the second temple.